Morning, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there today to work with you. My name's Tanya Leach, and part of the work that I do, as most of you already know, is working with schools to create a culture that empowers teachers to make evidence-based decisions that ensures that student learning is continuous. So I'll be teleconferencing with you this morning. However, I thought I'd just put together a brief overview of some of the key messages, themes and processes that you might like to consider using in your school. I'd also like to position that this whole process isn't about telling teachers what to do, it's about empowering, leveraging the existing practices that occur to ensure that there are shared understandings and consistency across your school. So I'm just going to share my screen now and move into a PowerPoint. There we go. So this is titled Purposeful Use of Data, and it's about knowing that the pedagogies that we use and the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis are in fact resulting in learning. So it's that teaching is learning. A lot of teachers have confidence talking about what they see, what they feel, and this is really just about ensuring that there's some integrity around that by evidencing it in a formal process. So I'm just going to quickly go through why it's important. I won't spend a lot of time on that because we can talk about that later, but it is a systemic requirement, school, and also really imperative for students and positioned really strongly in the AITSL professional standards in Standard 5. So it is our core business. The next one is how might you consider co-constructing that shared knowledge so that there is that connection between admin, teachers, and then of course that it transfers positively into classroom practice. And then let's explore just a couple of processes you might utilise to kickstart this while you shape it to meet your context. So, let's not go through that again. We know that the State Schooling Strategy says that it is our core business to know that every student is learning every day. And so in order to do that, we need to move from broad learning goals into really targeted and specific learning goals that can be observed and measured daily. So the documents that inform it, of course, are school improvement, every student succeeding, and the school improvement hierarchy. And as you know, there's lots of processes wrapped around that to look at the culture and the processes within schools. There's also a lot of research around it. So Lynn Sharrett and Michael Fullen, we base a lot of our work on the work there, and I've been fortunate enough to work with Lynn for the last 3 years, and acknowledge that we can't just look at data. I tend to use evidence of student learning instead of the word data from just one data set, but we need to look holistically. So how do we do that without creating too much work and too much stress for our teachers? We also need to know that there is an alignment between time provided for teachers, the context in which you work with, and of course that consistent data literacy or skills that teachers need to be able to feel confident in making these evidence-based decisions. So we're going to draw in those, and I wanted just to acknowledge that research is threaded through. So let's have a look now at how you might co-construct some of that shared knowledge. And I just would like to position why this is such a big process in a school or a focus within a school from a lot of the research I've done. So working with over 1,200 teachers across over 250 schools, we questioned teachers around how they decided what they'd cover, the content that they'd cover with their students. And 68% of teachers said they only used curriculum without student data. So they started from the Australian curriculum or the school framework or C2C, whatever you use in your school, and just started teaching. So that in itself raised some alarm bells because it meant that while they were adhering to the curriculum framework, perhaps where they were pitching the content wasn't actually the next step of learning for students. Then we asked how they're currently collecting data, and what we found, there was a huge strength and huge confidence in using informal formative tools. So observation was the first tool that teachers say they use. Work samples, any tests or end of weekly tests that they've created. Only 2% would acknowledge at that time whole school data sets. And of course, this might be different in your school, but this was the trend. And so what we saw from that was that there was a lot of confidence in using assessment tools that linked directly to the curriculum and what was happening in the classroom, but there was a lack of confidence in teachers using data sets that were typically represented as numbers or as letters because it took time to deconstruct and understand what that meant. And then the one that really alarmed me was when we were talking about reading with these teachers, we said, okay, so you've got this data, PM levels, PAT levels, NAPLAN data, whatever it might be. What do you actually do with that data? How does that inform teaching and learning? And 67% said that they used it to group students, which is absolutely fine. But when we went into focus group conversations, 67%, before it was 90% said grouping, my apologies, 67% said that they couldn't identify actually what the learning need was beyond moving towards the next level. So for example, they might have had a group of students sitting at a reading level 15 and they said, oh, they're moving towards a 16. And we said, well, what does that mean? And they didn't know, even when they had engaged in a running record and deconstructed that. So that's really where we started looking at, well, how can we build on teachers' strengths of using formative observation and work samples and some of our whole school data processes to really target student learning. When we did this, we came up with then the purposeful use of data model. And that means that we have whole school processes and data collection, year and class level, and then individual group level in the class. And what would happen would be that when there was no alignment, teaching down to those blue arrows there became very linear. So you'd be teaching maybe from a level 15, reading to a level 16, then a level 16 to a level 17, but we weren't actually cyclic in how we taught. Also, it wasn't typically all aligned. So when we say to schools, where does change happen? And we engage in conversations, we know that change happens in the classroom. But where is change measured? It's measured at whole school. So the whole school data sets, maybe your PM, your PAT, your A to E data, your NAPLAN data, we need to make sure that holistically that information is incorporated in a really simple way into the teaching and learning cycle. And of course today we're talking just about reading, so we're going to put a spotlight on that. So when we have purposeful use of data, we have holistic data collection processes, and many schools have that. People collect, but it doesn't go anywhere. So then we need to have processes that purposely analyse and we discuss data. So we might have data experts in the school that, STLANs, for example, that might really have high-level data analysis knowledge, and they might analyse that data and give it to teachers. What we found is that doesn't actually make a big difference on teachers' decision-making in the classroom. So what we want to do is build collective capability to analyse and discuss data, or as I said, evidence of learning. So we do that by utilising a couple of simple processes that will help to build teachers' data literacy capabilities, and then put reflection processes in place to monitor and tailor student learning needs and how teachers have achieved that by discussing pedagogy. So some overarching key aspects are that we need to build implicitly, so we don't go in and say there's a no excuses policy, but through these processes we promote and facilitate conversations that ensures that we are not using excuses. So a lot of the time teachers will say yes, they know where their students' learning needs are at, and many will, but when you ask them to evidence that, stress levels can rise. They're not sure what that means. Sometimes we have different understandings of the language we're using to talk about collecting evidence of learning, and so we need to break it down. And the best way to do that is in small groups where it's non-threatening and starting from a strengths-based, what they know, and scaffolding it to bring it in, acknowledging the strengths within the groups. And so this is a lot harder than a lot of people think it is. Being able to achieve that, is underpinned by developing that shared beliefs and understandings so all students can learn. And sometimes you'll hear teachers say, no matter how much I teach this, these kids just won't get it. That is a pivotal point. It means that what's happening at the moment isn't working. What else can we try? And it's that constant cycle. And yes, sometimes the growth is very slow. However, these processes are used across, as I said, hundreds of schools and even special needs schools where students are nonverbal, and their learning can be evidenced with really small targeted learning goals. So if it can happen there, it can certainly happen everywhere, and it does, and I've been able to evidence that. Then we talk about where intervention sits and what mindset teachers have around that, so how they use teacher aids, all those sorts of things start to come into play when we talk about pedagogy and structure in the classroom for achieving student learning goals. And then, of course, the hardest thing is ensuring that there's a whole school approach. So this takes time. It can happen within 6 to 12 months, but it's relentless, an unrelentless focus on student learning and talking about how we know. And so that's where those questions come into play. What are students' learning needs? How do you know? What's their next step in learning? What happens when they learn it quickly? What happens when they don't? We do that through the creation of SMART goals. Again, that's nothing new, and I'm going to just show you where that sits. And I apologise, I know this is really quick, so pause and we'll talk about it when I teleconference in. And then we have some structures which you as a leadership team will talk about and co-construct. And here's one model you might use. So we always start in the middle. So that shared understanding and belief, that moral imperative around why it's important to evidence student learning starts with the why. Why is this important? And having that discussion with teachers to capture their ideas and then move it forward by saying, look, it's also a requirement, but it's just great practice. And don't we all as professionals want to know that what we're doing is working? We then wrap around how, and these are the school processes that we're talking about today. So the PLC meetings, the collaborative data conversations, and using data in a purposeful way. So within that how, as I said earlier, we develop shared data literacy. We have opportunities to formally monitor and discuss the pedagogies that work, and also talk about how we gather evidence. Often when we go through this process, we also find that there are different notions of how to implement PM and running records, and that consistency can also raise up excuses conversations around, oh, well, you know, the student came to me and they said they were 26, but they really were 24, and I've had to repeat all the collection and it takes too much time. When we have those conversations, it's it indicates that teacher is in a high level of stress and still doesn't have that why, that moral imperative, and may need some support in overcoming that. The what is how you document it. So your whole school assessment plan, your data conversation plans, your timetables, and all those sorts of things that align to the systemic requirements. So let's move now to the last one, but positioning just a couple of those evidence-based practices. So this is the flow. When we can identify and reflect on the range of evidence that we have for student reading, we need to then look at what we're collecting and ask ourselves, are we over-collecting? Okay, so many teachers, when they go through this process, realise they're collecting too much data, and that's where a lot of their stress comes to. So we do a bit of a reflection on what we collect and why, when we look at establishing these whole school notions. Where you're looking at is just looking at your PM or PAT data, or probe data, sorry, and using that as a starting point. So we're just going to reflect on that. We then need to make sure that everybody understands how to turn those numbers into teaching and learning language, because only when a PM or a probe level or a PAT scale score is turned into teaching and learning language does it make sense and connect with teachers as to what they can see and then how they can collect that. Once we do that, we can then go, oh, okay, so here are our holistic learning needs for our students. Let me think about now what are the best pedagogies to do that. So we want to move conversation from saying, look, I'm going to do that in reading groups, to saying, that's great, what are you doing? And then how are you going to know it's been successful? And when we do all of that together, student learning is continuous. So let's look at the first two parts. And this is where we start to position this data conversation that does sit in two parts for you. As we move through this process, we know that in a class, teachers can really only work with 4 to 6 groups of students. Any more than that, it becomes overwhelming. So when we talk about creating individual student learning goals, often teachers think, oh my goodness, I've got to create 24 or 30, depending on the number of kids in your class, goals. That's just way too much. So we simplify it and we say, well, let's group our students, create group learning goals so that the 6 kids in that group, they all have the same learning goal, but that is also their individual learning goal. And then it becomes a lot more manageable. So when we do that, we look at the data we've collected, we interrogate it and say, look, is that true? What else is going on? What other information do we have? And then we infer possible reasons as to why they're sitting there. So, for example, if we're looking at collected data, you might have a class list of student names and PM levels. So we start talking about, what does this data tell us about student learning? And as it's presented there, is it purposeful? Why or why not? And the teachers who have deep knowledge of their PM levels, they have deep knowledge of how to do running records and extract that information, will be able to talk about that. What we're finding is as our teaching workforce transitions, we've lost a lot of that depth, and so we need to build it back in. So the conversations here are, look, if it's just a number, it really doesn't tell us anything. It just tells us the level of the book. So I do need to go in and look at that group's running records to see if there's a trend really quickly. Or I can use some of the other tools available to me. And in the beginning, we're going to use the flip charts and, if needed, the literacy continuum. So then we scan our students. We group them into those 4 to 6 groups on a template that I've sent through to you. And then we can use the flip charts, running records, or the literacy to continue to identify their next steps in learning. And on this, you'll see that we can't read it on here, but we'll pull it up in a minute, that the top part there are the typical reading behaviours from that PM reading level. And then we've got it linked to aspects that students may demonstrate. It's important to note that teachers need to verify this. It's not just a tick and flick. So we can go into the literacy continuum around reading text and around comprehension if we need to. So we say, what are they currently demonstrating? And we move into verifying and planning. So we look at the next step. So what learning has occurred? That's what we've just looked at. What next? How will I teach it? And how will I know they've learnt it? So this is a process that you will facilitate where teachers construct their understanding of student learning problems and test out their solutions together. So it's frequent data conversations. They bring these data templates back with them to say what worked, what didn't work. So there's the student learning goals. They've grouped their kids, they've identified where they're at, and they're looking at where to next. So they're the steps that you would take. And then I just talked to you about, and we'll talk about that when I teleconference in. And then when you move into a data conversation, they've grouped the students. We then now pick one student from the group to talk about it. So then we move into the collaborative data conversation. And that's where you've identified a student from your group. And what you're going to do is share your student learning needs, what they're currently demonstrating, their planned next step and what you need to teach. And you're going to start brainstorming pedagogies that you think will work for that student. So you'll discuss that, and you've got 2 minutes to do that. Then the teachers that are sitting around the table have 1 minute to ask you questions about that student and the pedagogies you've selected. Then for 3 minutes, the rest of the group talks, and you as a teacher do not talk, but you listen in, and you pull out some possible pedagogical strategies that you could use. Then when that 3 minutes have finished, there's a 1 minute reflection from the teacher who says, look, I heard what was said there. I think I'm going to try this strategy, and this strategy in the next 5 weeks for that student in that reading group. And that's recorded on the sheet. And then you step away and the next teacher has a turn. So each data conversation for a group takes about 7 minutes. So just to reiterate, you start by looking at your whole class data set. You group your students. You then place their reading levels. You look at additional resources, the flip charts or running records to say what are their current behaviours. Move across to say what's their next step in learning. Then you pause, and then you go into a data conversation where you pick one of your groups, one student within that group, and you have this conversation. When you come back the next time, you move straight into a reflection on your last data conversation, starting with this was the group, this was the student, this was the pedagogy that was suggested, here is my evidence of what's been happening and what worked, what didn't work. And when you engage in those conversations, what you actually do is shift the focus away from the collection of the data or evidence of learning into how it informs teaching and learning and the pedagogies that are working. So teachers love to talk about what they're doing in their classroom and love to share. So when one teacher's talking about a student, another teacher will be making connections with those students and thinking, oh, I can also use that strategy. So it becomes then about consistency of talking about pedagogies that work and evidence-based decisions, and also about then sharing effective practice across cohorts of teachers. So they really are big picture, very quick picture of how you begin this process. And there are many different pathways you can take as things pop up. But again, knowing that purposeful use of data is a systemic requirement, it's also really important for schools to ensure consistency and continuous learning for all students is occurring. And students are empowered when this process begins and deepens. Because once you've done this, we then move into students being part of the process. It's important that this isn't top-down directed, that there is expectations set from leadership, but it's co-constructed knowledge with teachers so that they are empowered to look at their strengths and to then share that for consistency. So we talk about this process is, while it may be a new process, it's not new thinking. We acknowledge that many teachers in this school are already using these processes, and this is one way of sharing and getting consistency across the school. We'd love your feedback and input as we begin this process so we can refine and contextualise. And then we look at the evidence-based practices, and we've looked at 2. So it's the collaborative data conversations, but making sure that we use those 4 processes. 1 is reflect upon the data we've collected. 2 is turn the numbers into teaching and learning language to identify targeted student learning goals. 3 is then selecting pedagogies to teach at. And 4 is identifying how you're going to know and coming back and evidencing what worked and also, really importantly, what didn't work. So other resources to support you in this are on the learning place. When you go to staff space, you can put in DDSW regional benchmarks. They are a open Ed Studio, and in that Ed Studio you'll see that you can go to the purposeful use of data one, which I'll take you to in a moment, but you can also go to the reading support resources, and these are all those flip charts. So you've got the PM flip charts, probe and pat R, which is sort of where we begin. Okay, so I know that was very quick, but I look forward to connecting with you at 11:30 this morning. Thank you.